Some genres, once they're created, really stand the test of time, don't they? High fantasy, fairy tales, war stories all last the test of time because they hit something deep in the human psyche. The horrors of war, teaching moral lessons, and embracing our sense of wonder. But what about the undeniable and common human feeling we've always felt no matter the time or place? Constant, existential, creeping feeling of, wow, this place fucking sucks. Well, that's what we talk about today. The relatively young genre that has so far stood the test of time and will probably last long after the show has died. Today we talk punk on Why Are You Talking About This? Nerd. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Waytat Nerd. I'm your host, William, and I will be your guide through the wild world of punk today. But before we keep going, I do want to thank you so much for listening. It means the world to me to have you install the virus-infested buggy brain chip containing a tap directly into my show. You should probably go to your local debugger's office to address that. That's probably not good. And also, really, it's really appreciated, even though it's super early. You guys mean a lot. But enough with the sappy stuff. I'm not allowed to have too much sappy stuff. My podcast manager, aka me, said to cut it the fuck out. So on to begging for clout. The best way to make the show grow and give the clout I want is to continue to stream and download the show, and make sure to share it with friends, family, lovers, enemies, and whoever has the displeasure of being stuck near you. I hear an elevator is a great place to start wigging people out. Also, leave reviews and comments so everyone knows I'm not a bot or a scammer, and also that you are not a fake viewer. Which, I hope you're not. I hope you're real. And finally, you can reach out to me in DMs on Twitter or Mastodon. Probably not Mastodon because I'm really new to it. Or comment on YouTube where I will see the comment, but probably not do anything about it. On to the show. Alright. It is punk time. Which means, of course, it's time for us to once again define something that doesn't really need to be defined. Although this is kind of an exception, because punk as a genre is both really vague, but it's also very specific once you actually look into it. I mean, because beforehand I thought it was all vibes, but turns out there's actually a formula to this. So let's start with the vagary. Punk isn't a single genre. Rather, it's a voltron of other genres roughly amalgamated into something about the size of a genre like sci-fi and fantasy. These niche genres all belong to punk because of their collective throwing off of the standards of other fictional genres, with a particular focus on different aesthetics, collective concepts, and their consequences, and a general outline of the matching time period's attitudes. Punk fiction has technology or its equivalent as a major theme and tends to retrofit modern or modern-ish technology to match the theme's style. Also commonly, there's a lot of themes of dystopia or authoritarianism with how exactly to address it depending on the specific genre. Like with cyberpunk, you just kind of have to deal with it and find a way to eke out an existence, while in steampunk, you're fully capable of toppling the regime, or in dieselpunk, you think you're working for the good guys, until you come to realize that every nation is equally evil, and it's just a matter of which ones you can justify to yourself. But if you look at the genre in passing, you Basically, wash a sci-fi setting in a particular aesthetic, tint the camera like you're an American TV show set in the Middle East or Mexico, connect everything back to this core technological concept, make it hate authority and its parents, and then stretch the concept to its absolute limits. But that's not as deep as it goes, because there is a deeper layer. See, all of these genres have three common elements. First, the entire world and setting is built around a particular level of technology or a particular aesthetic that is all-encompassing, all-consuming, and entirely inescapable, and performs tasks and operates in highly extrapolated ways. For example, in biopunk, you might have automated doors that is actually biologically engineered mold that just recedes when it senses the correct biometrics to go through the door. Secondly, the setting is either very gritty or transrealistic. Transrealistic meaning that it moves beyond realism into almost pure whimsy or fantasy, which would be like any punk setting where we aren't killing the world. Listen to WayTap for more info on that one. And finally, it's an exploration of modern social themes using a spec-fix setting. Basically, we're talking about, the inevitable decline and decay of capitalist society until essentially is an anarchical system only vaguely held in place by the artifice of money, while we pretend that we're talking about cyborg inner-city gangsters shooting each other and dealing robo-meth. So again, when you look at these genres at a glance, sure, they seem really vague. But like any other genre, there's parameters to be a punk genre. But that still leaves you with a lot of avenues to go down. So let's go through a list of a ton of different punk genres. Starting with the very first of the punk genres, cyberpunk. These are usually dystopian and highly pessimistic stories focused around cybernetics and the digital world. And obviously, stuff like Cyberpunk 2077 is a great example. A capitalist hellscape where you need to pay for the oxygen you use and for emergency services. But hey, you get a robot arm and a brain chip that you can use to access the internet whenever you want. Then there's biopunk, which is all about biotechnology and biomachinery, with plenty of medical experimentation, gene editing, and eugenics. These are also dystopian and full of body horror and questions of where you stop existing and the biomechanical machine you use for your job starts existing. Yeah, no shit. And a good example of this would be the game Scorn, which is a really, really good example of biopunk because everything in that game is made of flesh. A subtype of biopunk that tends to be a lot more hopeful and also like really horny would be anthropunk, where the furries are real and it's our fault. Basically, we went way too far with the gene manipulation and created hyena girls with anatomically correct genitalia. And third for the most common trio of punks is steampunk, where we use steam power as the core technology that binds our world together and also our sense of fashion stopped in the Victorian era. Usually things tend to be a lot more optimistic, but our enemies are still usually authoritarians of some kind. And there's actually a subgenre of this called cattlepunk, where no, we don't use cows instead of steam, but is steampunk set in the Wild West. And good examples of steampunk and cattlepunk would be Steamboy and Join a Hex, respectively. Also, steampunk seems to be most commonly more of a theme rather than its own thing in stories for some reason, but I'm not entirely sure why that is. But now, just kind of going down the list, we have atom punk, which uses atomic age aesthetic and technology from around the 1940s to 1960s, kind of like Fallout. Stone punk is Stone Age technology and culture, like the Flintstones, and aether punk, which uses magic as a stand-in for technology, like an Eberron. And all of these tend to be fairly hopeful, at least on the surface. I mean, it's pretty common for these settings to have a more optimistic side and a more like seedy, underbelly, pessimistic side. You know, kind of like a light side, dark side dynamic. And also, usually the people that have it good aren't really aware that people have it bad, or if they do, they don't usually care or think it's their fault until the incident occurs, and then they give a shit. Usually because they're kind of forced to give a shit to survive. There is also a subgenre of aetherpunk called dungeon punk that is usually full-on grimdark or gritty fantasy punk That's basically a mixture of fantasy with like modern ideologies, concepts, and cynicism. Like having magical cocaine and the concept of capitalism and socialism and other anachronistic elements, not only tossed in fantasy. Like the role playing systems, Heart and Spire. You'll also have Apocalypse, that are post apocalyptic settings that just kind of stayed that way. And you have subgenres of them like desert punk and pirate punk. They're like Mad Max and Waterworld, respectively. Sandalpunk is using ancient technology and classical civilizations, but with sci-fi technology. Like if the ancient Greeks had railguns and space travel, which is as terrifying as it should be. Clockpunk is a lot like steampunk, but based on 1700s cultures and using a combination of clockwork and centrifuge. And then we have the cynical middle sibling between steampunk and atompunk, dieselpunk. Dieselpunk is set in the era just after the invention of tanks and the end of World War II, and is extremely pessimistic and industrialized. Dieselpunk is basically like the full send, like, God is dead and we killed him type of thing, where you more often than not realize that, like, yeah, we're all evil and pieces of shit, and this war is never going to end. And Fallout also sometimes lands here, but another example would actually be Bolt Action's Conflict, I think it's 48 or 49, war game where World War II never ended, because it turns out that nukes are just extra-dimensional portals. I mean, kinda. They have, like, different effects for everyone. Like, I know the British lets them create robot men, and for the Germans to make zombies, and the Soviets get werewolves. Anyways, next is Formica Punk, which is basically like the 1980s never went away. Everything is sci-fi and futuristic, but has like the 80s block letters, neon, kind of like a neo 80s style, and hair metal. Also, there's still communists and the Soviets, and also Ronald goddamn motherfucking Reagan is still in office. Somehow. And then, of course, we have goth punk, where the world is trapped in perpetual rainstorms, like in an early 2000s new metal music video. Think like Vampire the Masquerade, early 2000s Marvel films, and Hellboy, the movies or the comics. Nanopunk is basically cyberpunk, but with nanotechnology. It's very shiny and chrome and smooth, with a lot of stark backgrounds. However, nanopunk is also very new compared to other genres, so we don't really have, like, a clear identity yet, because there hasn't been a lot of stories written in that kind of setting. And then we have a good number of the culture ones, like silkpunk, afropunk, mesopunk, native punk, and what are you doing, step punk? And these are all forms of punk filled with the aesthetic of the matching culture, like East Asian, African, Mesoamerican, Native American, and Mongolian, respectively, including their cultural traits, and also a ton of their mythology combined with modern and postmodern technology, which is pretty fucking sweet. Actually, I highly recommend looking at some pictures. There's not a whole lot of step punk pictures, but like the other ones have a good number of pictures. Then there is Cape Punk, like One Punch Man, My Hero Academia, and The Boys, that examines if superhumans are real and were either beholden to a high-level bureaucracy or an autocratic overseeing body. Candlepunk is medievalism turned up to 11, where you take all the normal punk tropes but assume that everyone's aesthetic never left the 12th century. And Warhammer 40k is close to this, but not quite, and there's not really a single distinctly candlepunk genre. A subgenre of this would be plague punk, taking place between the Black Death and the Renaissance. And this one focuses a lot on the cultures of the time, as well as having a lot of gross imagery of like skeletons and plague rats and shit. And also just shit. Again, Warhammer gets close to this, but only with its most nerdly delivery boys. Dreadpunk is basically answering what if the pre-20th century and gothic horror monsters were real, like Bloodborne or Sweeney Todd. Elfpunk is elf or fae-focused urban fantasy that is taking magical creatures and putting them into modern or futuristic environments. Fucking elves are back. You know, like Bright. A movie that I'm still gonna vaguely defend, but more as like baby's first racial allegory, and less like it's actually a good allegory. Flower punk is like biopunk, but instead of everything being biological, everything is instead powered by biological organisms. In the best interpretation, this is like power plants that are literal power plants. And in the worst, it's putting fairies in cum jars that suck the life out of them, so a kid can play on the iPad for 5 more minutes. Then there's whale punk and manor punk, which I put together because of how much more specific they are. Whale punk is named for the use of whale oil in everything, while manor punk is named for it being the Regency era, like it's a Bronte sisters book, but forever. Which is fair if that sounds like a nightmare, but hey, I like their books. Oh, also, the Regency era was 9 years. So, kind of taking like 9 years out of history and being like, oh yeah, we're going to write a whole genre based on this. But the last kind of punk we have actually subverts the genre a bit. How so? Well, they talk about social issues, but from a perspective that they're already solved. Rather than being satirical, it's basically fixing the issues we currently have, and then turning around, looking us square in the fucking eyeballs, and going, now is that so hard? And the poster child for this is solar punk, a genre where you combine environmental responsibility, African art and culture, and Art Nouveau, sorry, French people, and Art Nouveau style into a neoclassical whimsical future where we fixed most, if not all, of our problems, and things are actually a lot better now. Which is not only Gen Z avoiding all of our problems by making a fancy world to hide in, because yes, it is that too, but it's also serving as an inspiration and something to use to drive ourselves forward. Also, just because we've solved all of our problems doesn't mean that there's no space to write. There's options here. But some of the subcategories are tidal punk, which is solar punk with nautical nonsense, be something you wish, and lunar punk, which substitutes the African and Art Nouveau styles with goths, pagans, witches, and more than a few Hail Satans. I mean, personally, I think we can have both. I mean, solar punks during the daylight hours and the night workers are witchy goth lunar punks. I mean, fuck yeah. Also, this is the reality where the government gives us all goth girlfriends, and it's not a public control scheme, it's just a nice thing to do, and also, like, all the options are goth. Closely related would be ecopunk, where humanity is solving all of our problems with nature and the natural world, creating homegrown solutions for our problems, and living in harmony with nature. So, like, biopunk this time, but also healthy and respectful. You know, so, like, the doors aren't a mold spore that's being eradicated whenever it opens. It's a sheet of fungus that detects your pheromones and then blooms, which just so happens to open the door. It's also a bit less post-realism and whimsical than solar punk and its related genres, because oftentimes this is like a transitional period to that point. Or it's heavily oppressed, or the system has kinks, and we have to think about stupid shit like the economy and the legal system. But the last one we're going to cover here is called hope punk, which rebels not just against the normal sci-fi and fantasy tropes, but actually rebels against the punk genre itself. And yeah, this is kind of friendly fire, but it makes sense. Hope punk is that, yes, the world fucking blows and everything sucks and is awful and terrible and there's no joy or wonder, but that actually, what if you're wrong? What if the only way isn't to become a monster and die? Maybe, just maybe, being an activist can help. Being kind, even to people who betrayed you and wounded you deeply, and being forgiving can fix the broken world. Maybe cuteness, cuddliness, and some good old-fashioned wholesomeness can fix everything, and in Hope Punk, it actually works. In these stories, it's not like you're denying that there's terrible things you have to fight, but that your strength doesn't come from being some sick fucking freak that just so happens to be on the good side of history this time. Your strength comes from being the fact that you're choosing to stand up anyways. That you, an adorable 3'2" halfling waifu with mom energy, can fight an avatar of evil to protect a village of helpless humans one moment, and the next moment, bake a cake for the orc marauders that attacked your village, that started you on this quest in the first place because you realized along your journey they only did it because they were hungry and there were no other options. Also, I'm focusing on this so much because it really is the spirit of punk itself, When the world gives you shit, break it down, flip it and reverse it, and spit out the opposite as your weapon against the world. And I mean, really, the sky's the limit with like the whole punk genre, or this genre that's actually a bunch of genres in a trench coat. Just find a word to describe the aesthetic you're going for and stuff it in those three rules, and bam, you got a new genre. Just remember, they're meant to be speculative pieces where we address our fears and anxieties. But before I start getting emotional and talking about hope punk again, let's talk about the history of punk. And we begin in the 1960s, where the whispers of punk gets started. See, the 60s is home to the counterculture movement, where the idea was peace, love, and drugs, in direct opposition to the culture of the time being about stopping communism and duty to your country. Unless it's Vietnam vets. In that case, feel free to call them baby killers and cowards, even though the only difference from you is that they got unlucky and drafted. You can tell which part of history class is my least favorite. Anyway, a big part of this movement was pacifism. And I don't just mean in the non-violence way. I mean going with the flow. This will kind of come back later. But as far as the cyber part goes, this is also the origins of that, as new wave sci-fi explodes on the scene, stripping away the concept of the future being utopian and instead having shockwaves of our current issues. And notable for this era would be authors like Philip K. Dick, Roger Zelensky, J.G. Ballard, Philip Jose Farmer, and Harlan Ellison. And in 1976, punk culture arrives to us in the form of British punk. And this movement emerges as a combination and response to the 1960s counterculture movement, but combines it with rock and underground music, youthful rage and unfair world, and glam aesthetics. And this spreads widely across the youth in large part because of the Sex Pistols. And the genre of music and culture was a rebellion against stuffy, stuck-up parents and authority figures who responded to the very reasonable, hey, the world's on fire, can you maybe fucking fix that, with a, oh, I couldn't possibly, it's just how things work. And that's also, on top of that, a rebellion against the pacifist hippies that were saying, hey, the world's on fire, but that's okay, we don't have to do anything about it, it'll all work itself out. But the culture became built quickly on protest, imagination, and being provocative in both the sexual obnoxious ways, doing drugs, music, and a kind of like nihilistic glee at the end of all things, and how nothing truly matters. And the aesthetics smash together bright, fun colors and flashy clothes, often in contrasting or clashing patterns, and colors with whimsical imagery, but also sarcastic happiness, like those jokes your depressed friend makes that you should be worrying, that should be worrying you, but isn't, because he copes with his pain with humor. That's a call-out, by the way. Check on that guy, he needs it. But punk combined all of this with dark themes of self-harm and death, damaged clothing, and like rips and tears, fetish wear, and conflicting imagery, as well as incorporating graffiti, politics, and a fuckload of anger issues. The movement was about being unapologetically raw and truthful, being aggressive and embracing your anger and using it. It was also about a distrust of do-nothing authority and kind of boiled down anarchism and socialism into its basest elements. But it was also very individualistic and embraced conflicting ideologies, satire, and irony. And I tell you all of this so you can have an idea of why punk, as a writing genre, is like this. And cyberpunk would emerge around the same time, a story written by John Brunner called The Shockwave Writer, and the punk culture would come together with this story in the late 70s and into the 80s as punk culture sets its roots deep into Western culture and dissolving itself into an array of mainstream post-punk philosophies, art, music, games, and stories, including cyberpunk, which was named after the 1982 story Cyberpunk by Bruce Bethke, which combined themes and elements from Blade Runner, the infatuation of the West with Japanese angst to anime, and the stories of Pat Cadigan, Bruce Sterling and William Gibson to create this kind of grungy, angsty punk style of writing that made itself distinct from sci-fi and other spec fics. In 1984, the most archetypical cyberpunk story, The Neuromancer by William Gibson, is created. And since he knew fuck all about computers and, fairly did not really want to learn fuck all about computers, the computers in the story function a lot like magic does in fantasy, but kind of with like a sheen of digital, which would influence cyberpunk and give it its distinct style. But this is actually the end of the timeline. Why? Well, because from this moment on, we'll basically just be listing when every genre split from cyberpunk. But the other thing about punks is that they don't often write much down. So, that'd be a whole lot of needles and a whole lot of haystacks. But that being said, basically any form of punk you can dream up that's been made has probably had its roots in the mid-1900s and only really became a thing after 1984. So, let's talk about why this even matters at all. Alright, so now let's get into why this matters in the first place. First, primarily, it's because we need to understand something very important about fiction. And that is that there aren't really any rules, and punk is meant to remind us of that, because, really besides, rebel against authority, there's not a hard and fast rule to the genre. Really, all you need to do is find an aesthetic and just put that aesthetic all the way through your work. Punk writing reminds us to stay fluid about how we write, and also just sometimes say fuck it and make computers be able to control other people's cybernetic implants, despite having no wired or digital connections, because that's just cooler. It's a reminder that, well, yes, you should try with your writing, that doesn't mean you have to be bound by reality or what's real. That all of us, realism/believability addicts that constantly tear everything apart for the sake of realism, need to shut the fuck up sometimes and enjoy the story. And also, punk overall, culturally and in the writing style, is very important because these things remind us and are representative of the ideas of rebellion, self-expression, and celebrating your individuality and what that individuality brings to your tribe. And the thing is that punk doesn't shy away from some of the ugliness of these things. And in fact, oftentimes leans into it. Punk and its literary genres are important because it's an actual acceptance of ourselves and humanity. It's about being unapologetic, raw, ugly, rebellious, and contradictory. Which is why other sci-fi settings will have a very clean look at the future, or a future that's all misery, but will shy away from how it's individually miserable. But punk, cyberpunk especially, kicks in the door, says that the government can suck my cock and so can you, and writes about the ugly part of humanity and individuals that we don't usually enjoy talking about in our fiction. Cyberpunk very well might take a break from the story to show us one of the core characters sitting in an alleyway doing heroin with their tits out and taking a piss, and that's not entirely out of place, and also doesn't ruin that character. Because that is basically as raw human as you can get. And if it does get a reaction, good. Because that's a lot of the reason why punk exists. Almost to the point where the specific reaction doesn't particularly matter. Just getting that reaction is engaging with the spirit of punk. Of course, this is also something to be careful of. Just because something is raw and human doesn't mean you should champion it like it's a good thing. Punk is about writing the raw truth, not about writing about good stuff. Like being a racist piece of shit in your writing is, sure, raw and real. That happening doesn't mean that it's okay or acceptable and shouldn't be celebrated. And when people reasonably get upset with you, you can't just deflect by saying, hey, that's just a human thing. But regardless, the punk genres are also very important because of their politics. Remember, we use these to express anxiety, discuss problems, and extrapolate our hopes and fears beyond what's normally reasonable. Because punk ignores some of the specificity common to sci-fi and fantasy, You won't lose people for doing weird shit. So it's okay to go out on a limb and put down some actual deep existential anxieties, and people are more likely to be okay with it. And all that means, that we use these genres to give insights into what we think is wrong with the world and what could end up happening if we do nothing, or what could happen if we do something. But also, the retrofuturism is very interesting and important because it can easily be used to tell us that we always have been like this and probably always will be. Every time period and every culture has assholes, but the protagonists always pick up that mantle, even if the assholes they fight are the little guys and not the reason why the world is shit. Improving your own life is still worthwhile. Think about it like this. While sci-fi can be used to make broad and general conceptual spaces and grave warnings, these are unspecific prophecies. Punk lets you point at someone in the audience and give them an oracle-style prophecy. Because it's individualized and human and follows single people without giving a shit about the top-down perspective, you make people see themselves in your work more readily, filling them with the spirit you're going for. And they don't really even have to do a lot of the legwork for it. I mean, yeah, fuck me, right? I'm just a nerd with an English degree. So let's talk about how to write this. Okay, so since the whole thing with punk is that you only usually write it if you truly believe in the genre and like the aesthetic with less concern about specific detail and not about being a true artist or a faker, the stakes are a little bit lower. So, yes, you can take this entire section and boof it if you want to, but that statement doesn't mean you should give up on trying to write something good. Instead, that means don't sweat it. Most people in these genres aren't going to come down on you too hard. Just remember, you don't have boundaries, but you do have vibes to keep in mind, and keep it quirky and unique. So, here's some ways to keep in touch with the genre. First of all, lean in. Identify what makes your choice of punk cool and appealing to you and lean into it. Use the themes and tropes you like with your own flares and elements added to them, but don't be worried about being called out for not breaking the mold. Like, for example, if I was going to write a solar lunar punk story, because I fucking love lunar punk, I'd make the aesthetic of the setting changing with the night-day cycle, for one, but also on the lunar punk side, seeing as I am a practitioner of witchcraft, I would lean into my own particular brand. Sure, everything is neo-goth, and people walk around at night wearing bioluminescent makeup, and half the buildings are covered in cool, cute blue mushrooms. But if you go about 15 minutes in the woods, there's a wood-carved statue to an ancient goddess bathed in firelight, where some of the neo-goths are wearing wolf pelts and dancing around it. And their nighttime society wears charms and symbols made from copper, bronze, and wood, in addition to their holographic iPhones and fairy wings. But, obviously don't just copy-paste someone else's story. Hopefully obvious. Second, break unnecessary and unneeded tropes. Find the things that are used in the genre you're writing in, or the over-genre, like sci-fi and fantasy, that you don't like or don't need in your story, and beat its ass. Take all of the assumptions about your setting just because of its genre and take them behind the woodshed. Like how in cyberpunk, the corporations that own everything and everyone are usually Japanese or American. Shut up, phone. And that comes from the specific angst people were feeling about these companies when the genre was created. And also, to be fair, if a corporation was going to try, it'd be one of those companies anyways. I mean, you are familiar with both Disney and Nintendo, don't lie. But what if instead it was a Russian company, or an Indian one, or hell, really break the mold and make it a company that is not on the top 10 list of global industrialized nations, like Kenya or Malaysia or Guatemala? Or what if society is owned and controlled by actual criminals and a kleptocratic crime family? Or what if the person in charge is just a computer? All these are subgenres of cyberpunk that are just as valid and can bring some cool and unique flares to your story that aren't in others. Third, start from the very beginning. Don't copy the work someone else did. Instead, choose a technology or culture, punkify it, and then justify it in your own way. Like, for example, why is everything in your world steampunk? Maybe to you it makes sense for everything to be steampunk because the necessary steps to alter the world's culture never happened and people assumed, well, this is clearly the peak of organized society and never deviated. Or maybe it's a handful of madmen that like the aesthetic and keep us this way because they're fucking bonkers. Once you've justified it to yourself, use that to justify the setting to your audience. Mind, you don't need to. Your audience isn't usually tearing at their clothes for justification or a reason why things are steampunk, but it'll help your writing be a little deeper. And this justification doesn't necessarily have to follow a strict realism. Like, neither of those reasons are exactly realistic, but they are a vibe. Fourth, forge your own genre. While there's a ton of punk genres, it's by no means the end of the line, and the well is nowhere near dry. There's millions of cultures, thousands of years of human history, and dare I say, billions of inventions and concepts to slap the word punk onto. Like, how about neon punk, where the entire world is in that weird, like, gilded urban mall decay style that you see at the weird, outdated Chinese restaurants tucked in the corner of outlet malls. Like, it looks nice, but, like, it looked nice 30 years ago. But now it just kind of looks dingy and fake. Or astropunk, where everyone is in space and the entire thing is on space stations and where the void is always right there. Or mine punk, where everyone lives in the coal mines. I mean, fuck it, carnival punk. I mean, really, the sky's the limit because punk is meant to be weird, so get weird. And last but not least, continue the conversation. More than other genres, part of the appeal of punk is that it's a conversation between artists, making commentary about what's already being said, adding their own opinions, and replying to people who've done the same to their work. Punk is pulpy, it accepts weirdos, and also many of its genres have the same conceptual grounds to stand on, so it's a lot easier to have conversations in story about the story to other punk writers. So find other writers and create a unique story to respond to theirs with, and then let people do that to yours. Like, for example, Cyberpunk Edge Runners, in a lot of ways, was kind of like a conversation with Cyberpunk 2077, taking place in the same universe with a lot of other cyberpunk, and also sharing a lot of characters. Both are about losing yourself, but in Edge Runners, it's about losing yourself to your own choices. On 2077, it's about losing yourself in the name of others. Not entirely by your own choice, but you have a little bit of agency in how exactly you lose yourself. And the conversation is essentially debating, well, who's more fucked? Because let's be real, the least fucked is as happy of an ending you get in Cyberpunk. But all that being said, it won't really help you conceptualize. Luckily for you, I have another list of things to do to help you nail down the concept you're after. So, firstly, nail down the exact kind of social vibe you're going for, and what exactly it is you're trying to discuss. For Cyberpunk, for example, the society is usually dystopian because everyone's focused on power, money, and survival. The entire society is forced to deal with predatory corporate practices and products, and the only way to survive is to obey the system or be strong enough to kill whoever you need in order to live. Basically, start by figuring out and building your metaphor. Secondly, figure out the technology level of your world and how things work. Take all the things you want to include from today or future tech or older technologies that'll still be in use and change the look and feel of how it works and its form to make it fit into the setting. Like, for example, if you are doing a Candlepunk game and you want a character to have a prosthetic arm, you need to not only like make it clearly out of wood, but also cover it with plate armor to hide its function and also to obviously, protect it. And if you just add some ropes and pulleys in sensible places and keep some basic mechanical practices in mind, you don't really need to describe how it works. Just make it clear how it's moving and most people will be okay with that. Yeah, like if you need to, like put a rat in there turning a wheel. I mean, because one, that's fucking funny, but also means that's a thing you need to address whenever that arm gets damaged. Third, build out the world's politics. Make sure you don't forget your themes and tech, and make sure to keep them incorporated, but also ensure to include the politics of when you're drawing from as an inspiration. Like if you're doing a Formica punk setting, it would make the most sense to have a Soviet-esque nation threatening the nation that your characters are living in that's under the oppressive thumb of a Reagan-ass president, i.e., stripping away all protections and the security of the future for corporate profits and telling you it's okay because you're cucked and blue-pilled and actually believe the nonsense. Or if you're going more into sandalpunk, keep the high levels of tech, but make the ruler a world-conquering, lead-from-the-front emperor who is nearly immortal, and we're back to 40k. God damn it. Fourth, build up the minutiae. Because punk gets more focus on the flair of your setting and all the little... Holy shit, train. Anyways. Fourth, build up the minutiae. Because punk puts more focus on the flair of your setting and all the little cool bits and bobbles and hitting that nitty gritty. Because once more, we're actually talking about the modern day, but not actually talking about it, but we are actually kind of like how in cyberpunk, the best example for these in general, it's very common for there to be things like nanomachine-laced cocktails designed to fuck with your cybernetics to cause hallucinations, or subscription chips to VR porn for your own mobile gooning cave. There's also a lot of computer slang, techno lingo, and gamer words mixed into modern slang, poor people slang, and gang slang, and slang. Since punk is about the individual, you need to flesh out the details of what an individual does day to day more than other genres. And finally, craft an appropriate ending. Most punk settings are going to be on the spectrum of how hopeful of an ending you can have without pissing your audience off. In general, solar punk, steampunk, and hope punk all get to have genuinely good endings where things go well and everyone ends up happy ever after, and the bad guys lose. However, on the other hand, cyberpunk, dreadpunk, and gothpunk tend to be oppressive and depressing. Things often go horribly wrong, or you realize at the end that these characters were literally only there to die to show how badass someone else is, and they all know it. So make sure you understand your genre before you start writing in it. But with that, onto the soapbox. I don't think it should really come as a surprise given how highly I talked up this group of genres, but I love punk. I didn't think it was my kind of thing until I really did the research, but I really do truly love and enjoy this genre. Looking into it and reading about it, it was really inspiring and gave me a ton of ideas I want to do someday. I'm probably not ever going to actually be able to do them, but I'm willing to delude myself into hoping. Regardless, I think these genres are really cool and have a very unique place in fiction. Distinct, but not dissimilar to sci-fi and fantasy. That all being said, am I going to start consuming a lot of it? Maybe not. Because sure, it sounds fun and cool and interesting, but me as a person can barely stand a lot of stuff. I have the crushing depression of half of the genre is way too much for me, but so is the unbridled optimism of the other half. And while the aesthetic is cool and inspiring, I really prefer stories with bigger scale. Remember, I grew up on like Lord of the Rings battle scenes, Warhammer, and Ranger's Apprentice. I'm not going to be able to enjoy a small scale story. I'm not going to be able to enjoy a small scale story nearly as much. But again, not to say that I don't respect the hell out of the genre. It's sweet as hell. On to the end. Man, I really gotta stop doing topics I like. Stop making my opinion really obvious. Anyways, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast feed, like it, leave a review, whatever else it is you can do on your platform of choice. Send me an email at waittadpods@gmail.com with questions, concerns, opinions, compliments, insults, actuallys, your personal style of punk, hate mail about my cyberpunk takes, and anything else you want to tell me. Also follow me on Twitter at waytat_pods. Remember to check out my other podcast, Waytat, where I talk about other topics that are usually a lot more depressing somehow. Anyways, have a good night, have fun, keep writing, and remember, maybe the punk was the friends we made along the way. This has been Why Are You Talking About This Nerd? I've been your host, William. Good night.